This is one of the last unexplored points on planet Earth, the forests of the Amazon. The jungles, located in South America, cover an area equal to 10 Frances. Even in the era of drones, airplanes and satellites, no one knows exactly what lies hidden in the dense thickets. For centuries, travelers, archaeologists, cartographers and hunters for treasure and glory have sought lost cities in this place. One of the most enigmatic points was considered to be the city of Zed. Many of those who searched for this place went missing. The most famous case was the expedition of Percy Fawcett. In the year 1925, the explorer embarked on an expedition to the Amazon. He was accompanied by 2 companions. Fawcett was an experienced explorer and a member of the British Geographical Society. This was not his first expedition to the Amazon. He had already encountered cannibal tribes, the most poisonous snakes, deadly diseases, and always returned alive. Fawcett had evidence that a lost civilization existed in the thickets of the Amazon, an ancient city with roads, bridges, houses, and temples. This discovery could change our understanding of human history. Fawcett's expedition was a global event. For 5 months, he sent messages to newspapers, and they detailed the progress of the expedition. Then suddenly, the reports ceased. After that, neither Fawcett nor the other 2 participants were ever seen again. The disappearance of the travelers became one of the main mysteries of the 20th century. Over the past century, numerous expeditions have tried to find Fawcett. According to some estimates, about 100 people died during the searches. What happened to the seasoned traveler who had been in the jungles many times and was considered invincible? Did that very civilization truly exist in the Amazon's thickets, and how do modern discoveries confirm Percy Fawcett's theories? This is the story of the lost city of Zed. January 1925. A large passenger liner set out from the port of New Jersey in North America. The destination, Brazil's Rio de Janeiro. For most passengers, this is a comfortable ocean voyage on a luxurious ship with all the amenities and entertainment. However, for Percy Fawcett, the journey to Rio is just the beginning. A tall, slender English gentleman with twirled moustaches. He was 57, but the only thing that betrayed Percy's age was his thinning hair. Fawcett was a robust man and an experienced explorer of the Amazon forests. If the character Indiana Jones had existed in the early 20th century, many would have recognized Percy Fawcett in him, a fearless explorer cutting through the impenetrable jungles with a machete in hand. For his numerous expeditions to the Amazonian forests, Fawcett earned a reputation for invincibility. Not everything is known about this territory in South America, but what is certain is that it is one of the most dangerous places on the planet. Some of the most poisonous snakes and spiders, wild predators, fierce cannibal tribes, and insects capable of consuming a person from the inside dwell here. Moreover, the Amazonian forests were often called the Green Desert. Despite the rich vegetation and plentiful wildlife, almost none of it was suitable for consumption. There was nothing but despair. This is how one traveller described the area. Percy Fawcett did not agree with this last assertion. In the year 1925, the Amazon jungle had been even less explored than it is today. The traveller claimed that a lost city lay hidden in the thickets. He was not speaking of the Golden El Dorado, which, after centuries of searching, was considered a myth. According to Fawcett, there existed an advanced civilization in the Amazon that had never contacted the Western world. These people had lived there long before the first Europeans arrived on the continent. Percy called the habitat of this people by the enigmatic symbol Z. The discovery of this city could completely change the perspective on the history of humanity. Fawcett was not a mad amateur adventurer. He was a professional explorer, a member of the Royal Geographical Society. He had spent many years on expeditions in the area and had been awarded a medal for his merits in the exploration of the Amazon. According to him, the existence of the lost city was indicated by tribal stories, findings of clay pottery, and documents found in archives. Besides Percy, 2 other people participated in the expedition: his son Jack Fawcett and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel. Both were in their early 20s. The preparation and progress of the expedition were extensively covered by newspapers, quickly turning all participants into celebrities. The media buzz, on one hand, helped the travelers to gather funding for the expedition. On the other hand, Fawcett worried that if they disappeared, many would go searching and perish. For 5 months, the explorers sent messages with reports to newspapers. Then, unexpectedly, the messages ceased. The last known location of the expedition was deep in the Amazon jungle. The place was called Dead Horse Camp. At first, no one panicked. Fawcett had warned that communication might break off for a month or two as they trekked through the impenetrable jungle. A year went by, 2. The disappearance of the expedition became world news. What had happened to them? Were they taken hostage or killed by indigenous people? Did they die of hunger and disease? Were they able to find that very lost city? In the mid-20th century, the New York Times reported that the number of those who tried to find Percy Fawcett exceeded the number of people who had sought El Dorado over the centuries. According to some estimates, hundreds of people died in the search for the missing expedition. None of the explorers succeeded in finding either Fawcett himself or the lost city of Zed, at least until the recent past. Percy Fawcett's fate was meant to be different. He was born into an aristocratic British family in the late 1860s. Percy's father was prophesied a great future. However, a penchant for alcohol and gambling ruined those bright prospects. Fawcett Sr. died early, yet still managed to squander nearly all of his family's fortune. After completing school, Percy went to a military academy, received a junior officer's rank, and was assigned to an artillery unit on the island of Ceylon, one of the many British colonies. Military service quickly bored Fawcett. Tedious official ceremonies and procedures formed the basis of the daily routine. One day, Percy came across a mysterious old letter. It claimed that treasures lay beneath a mountain of stones in one of the island's settlements. The search for the site captivated the young officer. In the end, the information from the mysterious letter led nowhere, but in the process, Fawcett discovered something more important: a relentless thirst for discovery. The officer decided to undergo training at the Royal Geographical Society and become a professional explorer. For centuries, travelers have explored the world. One of the main goals was cartography. However, despite all efforts, many blank spaces remained on the planet's map. These were often filled with semi-mythical creatures, monsters, and plants from legends and myths. The main task of the Royal Geographical Society was precisely to study places where no human foot had stepped and to map them. All potential society participants underwent complex training. Students were taught to navigate terrain even without a map, to meticulously observe and record everything encountered along their path. A significant part of the training was communication with wild tribes. Travelers were advised to perceive them as equals, although at the time it was believed that many peoples of Africa and South America were inherently inferior compared to Europeans. One of the main skills, of course, was survival. For example, students of the Geographical Society were trained how to extract their own painful tooth, how to treat themselves from a poisonous snakebite by applying gunpowder to the wound and cutting away part of the skin, how to heal the site of an Indian arrow wound with boiling fat. And for a moment, it might seem like the career of a Geographical Society explorer resembled a survival show on the Discovery Channel, but it was not so idyllic. For instance, future explorers were taught how to behave in the event of a severe illness or the death of a colleague, in which case it would be appropriate to leave a member of the expedition alone in the jungle, or how to properly conduct a funeral if someone didn't survive. The majority of Geographical Society students, including Fawcett, found these skills useful in their future expeditions. After a year of training at the Geographical Society, Fawcett received his first assignment. He was sent to Morocco as a spy. The British authorities often used archaeologists, cartographers, and other researchers as cover for espionage activities. In the North African country, Percy Fawcett moved among local elites, monitored the Sultan, and sent reports about him to his superiors. However, this activity was not exactly what the explorer initially became a member of the Geographical Society for. Therefore, When he was offered to head to the dense jungles of South America, he readily agreed. It was the year 1906. Percy Fawcett was about 40 years old. He embarked on his first expedition into the Amazon forests. In Britain, his wife and young son awaited his return. Percy's task was to map the disputed border between Bolivia and Brazil. A portion of this boundary ran through dense, unexplored jungles, and no one knew for sure where the border actually lay. Meanwhile, this territory was significant for both nations as it housed groves of rubber trees. Rubber, the primary material for manufacturing rubber products, was rapidly gaining popularity worldwide. The collection of rubber in the Amazonian forests was almost entirely controlled by local barons. These barons exploited the local inhabitants for meager wages, and when the workforce was insufficient, they dispatched their men into the jungles to abduct members of wild tribes and use them as slaves. This reality greatly complicated the work of explorers in the Amazon. Many of the local tribes were initially hostile to outsiders. Apart from people, the principal danger of the Amazon forests was the jungles themselves. During his first expedition, Percy Fawcett, a few companions, and 24 Bolivian hirelings experienced this firsthand. As they navigated through the dense thickets, they encountered some of the most venomous snakes on the planet. Wild animals ranging from boars to jaguars, piranhas and electric eels, poisonous frogs whose mere touch can kill a person, as well as kangaroo fish capable of crawling into the human urethra and feeding on blood from within. However, the main issue was creatures of significantly smaller size. Insects, swarms of ants capable of turning a backpack or clothing into a pile of threads overnight, ticks that fed on human flesh, worms that caused blindness, flies that laid their eggs under the skin. Finally, mosquitoes carrying a myriad of deadly diseases from malaria to yellow fever. As a professional traveller should, Fawcett kept records. Every day he described new problems brought on by insects. On the 20th of October, attacked by tiny mosquitoes. Mosquito netting is ineffective, nearly sleepless due to the bites. On the 21st of October, another sleepless night due to blood-sucking mosquitoes. On the 22nd of October, my entire body is covered in bites, arms are swollen. Second night, nearly without sleep. On the 24th of October, almost half of the team is ill due to insects. Due to the bites, the whole body is smeared with iodine. After 6 months, nearly all of Fawcett's expedition members were sick, mostly with malaria or yellow fever. At times they could not move, some vomited blood, 2 hirelings died. Fawcett was compelled to release several others due to their poor condition. Another potential source of danger was the indigenous tribes. Many of them had never contacted the outside civilization. Some of the tribes practiced cannibalism as a ritual or as a source of food. Despite this, Fawcett instructed his men under no circumstances to shoot at the indigenous people. The explorer believed that only a non-violent approach could help establish contact with the locals. Once, when members of the expedition were rafting down the river, arrows were launched at them from the shore. In the thickets, they spotted members of a tribe with large bows in their hands. In the end, none of Fawcett's men were harmed. This attack did not change the traveller's views, and in subsequent expeditions, he continued his non-violent policy. Despite all the difficulties, a year later the explorer successfully completed the expedition and did so ahead of schedule. Some of the existing borders on the South American continent were determined by Percy Fawcett. For the next few years, Fawcett spent time on expeditions, continuing to explore the Amazon jungles. During these explorations, he gradually developed the idea of the existence of a lost, advanced city in the South American forest. This theory was not new. Centuries earlier, travelers had attempted to find the famous El Dorado. The 16th century historian Oviedo wrote about a marvelous place in South America. There people wore armor made of gold, used golden tableware, and even covered their bodies with golden dust. The phrase El Dorado literally translated as the Golden Man. The conquistadors learned about this place from the tales of the indigenous people. Overall, in the early 16th century, the existence of El Dorado seemed quite plausible. In the year 1519, the Spanish conqueror Hernán Cortés discovered the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, on the territory of modern-day Mexico. There, the conquistadors saw impressive pyramids, palaces, statues, and ornaments. Some of the Spanish soldiers were so impressed that they asked if it was all a dream. 14 years later, Francisco Pizarro conquered Cusco, the capital of the Incas, whose empire once numbered over 10 million people. The immense wealth of the Incas was described by many historians of that time. A few more years later, Francisco Pizarro's brother Gonzalo embarked on the first expedition into the Amazon jungles in search of El Dorado. Accompanying him were 200 Spanish soldiers and nearly 4,000 indigenous people used as slaves. The expedition ended in failure. After a year, almost all the indigenous people and half of the Spanish soldiers died from disease and starvation. They found no traces of the Golden City. In the subsequent centuries, attempts to find El Dorado were repeatedly made. Researchers spoke of terrifying monsters, fierce women resembling Amazons, and other astonishing phenomena. However, the location of the Golden City remained a mystery. By the early 20th century, the scientific community was convinced that the numerous stories about El Dorado were merely myth. The same was believed about the accounts of Amazons, people with dog heads, and others. It was thought that these stories were invented solely to justify the large number of deaths from disease and starvation among those who set out in search. Fawcett understood that many stories about El Dorado were either complete fabrications or greatly exaggerated. However, he was convinced that at least part of these legends had a very real basis, meaning that a populated city might have existed in the Amazonian jungle. This was indicated by the data he had managed to gather during several expeditions. He called the mysterious place Zed. What exactly Fawcett meant by this is unknown. In the early 20th century, theories about the existence of lost advanced settlements in the Amazon jungles were met with much skepticism. It would be more accurate to say that most of the scientific community did not take this idea seriously, and not only due to centuries of failed searches for El Dorado, but more so because of the harsh conditions of the Amazonian jungle. The skeptics' theory of an advanced civilization in the Amazon grabs onto the following notions. The sparse tribes that inhabited the area did not have the opportunity to develop due to the constant struggle for survival. People had to contend with a vast number of threats, from wild animals to diseases. Due to the specific climatic conditions, the development of agriculture in the jungle was not feasible. Hunting and gathering were also problematic. As a result, people did not have the resources to develop complex forms of society, communication, or culture. No art, no writing, no society. This is how one of the researchers described the situation. This theory was partially confirmed by Fawcett's own expeditions. During the second expedition, the team's food supplies ran out. Initially, they had taken little provisions to lighten the passage through the jungle. It was almost impossible to navigate among the dense thickets with many horses, tons of provisions and tools. Therefore, Fawcett decided to carry a minimal load and mainly rely on hunting and gathering for food. However, traversing the impenetrable jungles was still very difficult. On average, the team managed to cover less than 1 kilometer per day, and once the provisions were depleted, it emerged that in the jungles, where everything seemed to flourish and move, there was practically nothing to eat. No wonder the seekers of El Dorado called these places a green desert or a green hell. Fawcett and his men subsisted on rare nuts and palm leaves. Catching fish in the local rivers proved almost impossible. One day the researchers spotted a wild deer. Fawcett managed to shoot it, and the expedition members cooked the animal over the fire. However, this stroke of luck was more of an exception. Percy Fawcett began to seriously fear a mutiny. Most of his team demanded to end the expedition and return. In the end, Fawcett conceded. They returned. But even despite that, almost half of the team members died within a few days from the effects of starvation and disease. Despite the failure, Percy Fawcett set out almost immediately on another expedition. In less than 10 years, he undertook several journeys into the Amazon forests. He knew that many tribes in the area were potentially dangerous. They attacked outsiders with poison-tipped arrows, and captives were killed and their skulls used as cups. Nevertheless, Percy Fawcett believed that the only way to gain the Indians' trust was to refrain from showing any violence toward them. According to the recollections of another researcher who accompanied Fawcett on many expeditions, Fawcett would meet the Indians in the same manner each time. Percy would demonstratively throw his machete to the ground and raise his hands, holding a handkerchief in one of them. Then he would begin to move toward the Indians. An equally important condition for successful contact with the locals was gifts. These made up a significant part of the cargo taken by the explorers. If the Indians did not receive gifts, the travelers could face disastrous consequences. Such was the case during a 1910 expedition when Fawcett managed to communicate with the tribes. Despite the challenging environment in which these tribes, consisting of a few hundred people, lived, they appeared healthy and were not starving. It turned out they learned to find edible fruits in the jungle thickets. They also caught fish by spreading the juice of a certain plant in the river, which attracted the catch and had a slight toxic effect. Once the fish ingested this juice, they would immediately float belly up and could be easily collected. The toxins affected the fish temporarily, and some would revive and swim away after a while. The poison was not harmful to humans. Additionally, Fawcett discovered that these tribes had developed numerous methods for treating typical jungle diseases using herbs. These findings, albeit indirectly, proved that human communities in the jungle could theoretically not only survive, but also thrive. This suggested that the lost city could be a reality. Along with indirect evidence, Percy Fawcett found several tangible arguments in favor of his idea of a lost city. During one of the expeditions, he found fragments of clay pottery. The level of craftsmanship with which these pieces were made was comparable to that of old European and Chinese counterparts. However, these shards were found deep in the Amazon jungles, where it was unlikely that Europeans or Chinese had set foot. Thus, the pottery must have been made by local inhabitants, beyond the capabilities of small, wild tribes. Percy Fawcett also claimed that he had found an interesting geometric phenomenon on the jungle ground, reminiscent of ancient overgrown roads or embankments. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for his theory was not found in the jungle but in an archive, the so-called manuscript 512. The author described discovering a large ancient city in the Amazon jungles in the year 1753. There were remnants of houses, temples, statues, and roads. The place resembled a once thriving city. The document also contained sketches of the site. Very similar drawings were discovered in Fawcett's own records. This confirms that he saw the document. In the year 1911, another interesting event took place. The American professor Hiram Bingham discovered in Peru the lost city of the Incas, known as Machu Picchu, a city with a complex structure and advanced architecture and technology for its time. This all meant that the existence of the lost city of Zed was more than possible. Its discovery would significantly surpass the discovery of Machu Picchu. In any case, a lot was already known about the Inca civilization before this. However, the existence of a developed settlement in the harsh conditions of the Amazon was considered impossible. Thus, the city of Zed could change science's perspective on the development of humanity. In the year 1914, an event occurred that almost put an end to Fawcett's plans to discover the lost city. The First World War began. He, as an artillery officer, was called to service and sent to the front, along with several researchers who accompanied him on expeditions. After witnessing the battlefields, Fawcett questioned whether Europeans could indeed be considered more civilized than the wild Indians of the Amazon. Trenches filled with mangled bodies, the horrors of gas attacks, and the bloody carnages, the likes of which humanity had never seen before. In the year 1916, Fawcett participated in the famous Battle of the Somme. It is still considered one of the bloodiest battles in human history. On the first day alone, 20,000 Britons were killed. In one of the gas attacks, Fawcett was severely injured and sent for medical treatment. During the war, he was awarded a combat honour as well as a medal from the Royal Geographical Society for his exploration of the Amazon. Percy Fawcett was already 50 years old. He was recovering heavily from his wounds. For the first time in his life, he spent a lot of time with his family, his wife, 2 sons and a daughter who barely knew their father. He was always missing, either in the jungles or on the fronts of the First World War. At that point, it seemed that his exploration career was over. But despite his age and injuries, a few years after the war ended, Fawcett began planning a new expedition in search of the lost city. A strong motivation was his sense of rivalry. At the same time, the American traveller Alexander Rice was also researching the Amazon. Fawcett feared that Rice would succeed in discovering the lost city. Percy's rival had a significant advantage: money. He had inherited a large fortune and could afford not only to finance his own expeditions but also to use very expensive modern equipment. For example, airplanes with photographic capabilities or bringing radio into the jungle for transmitting messages. All this was unavailable to Percy Fawcett. He could not fund the journeys himself. Even finding a small budget for research was very difficult. Few believed in the existence of the lost city of Zed. Nevertheless, Fawcett managed to secure a small amount of funding, and in the early 1920s he embarked on a couple of expeditions. However, both attempts ended in failure. At the beginning of the year 1925, Fawcett was 57 years old. He was embarking on another expedition into the Amazon forests and did not yet know that it would be his last. Taking his son and his son's friend as companions seemed like a good idea. True, they had no experience, but firstly, they were certainly loyal to Fawcett and would not stage a mutiny, and secondly, they did not need to be paid. Due to a limited budget, Fawcett set out on the expedition without payment. He was supposed to receive compensation only if he successfully completed the mission, meaning the discovery of the lost city. When Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel reached Brazil, they eagerly listened for news about Alexander Rice's expedition. Rice had scoured thousands of square kilometers of jungle by airplane. For a pedestrian explorer, traversing such distances would have been simply impossible. However, despite this, Rice did not find any traces of the lost city. At the same time, Fawcett knew that exploring the most remote parts of the Amazon forests could only be done on foot. At the end of April in the year 1925, they set out from the Brazilian city of Cuiabá and headed into the jungle. The 3 travelers were also accompanied by 2 Brazilian guides, several horses and dogs. From the start of the expedition from New York, newspapers were writing about them. Fawcett constantly sent messages and telegrams with updates. This was a condition for receiving funding. The communications continued even after the explorers began their journey into the jungle. Fawcett sent letters through couriers. Thus the whole world, including Fawcett's wife, was aware of their progress. Fawcett wrote about the difficulties of the journey, about how the participants once lost each other, only to be found in the end, about how Raleigh Rimmel struggled with the expedition. Due to insect bites, his legs were in pain, and he began to speak of his desire to go back. However, he later changed his mind, either because he was afraid of seeming a coward or feared going alone. By the end of May, the team reached a place known as Dead Horse Camp. Fawcett gave it this name during one of his previous expeditions when his horse died there. The animal's bones still lay on the ground. From there, he sent his last message. He reported that he would try to send a message in the upcoming months or year, but it might not be possible, as by the time this message is printed, they would already be far into uncharted territory. He told his wife, Nina Fawcett, not to be afraid of failure. From there, Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel continued on without the guidance of the guides. They have not been seen since. Thus began one of the great mysteries of the 20th century. It had been 2 years since Percy Fawcett sent his last message, and although his wife and Raleigh Rimmel's relatives continued to tell reporters that they were expecting news from the explorers any day, the general anxiety in the media was gradually mounting. Some people speculated that the travellers had fallen victim to hostile tribes. Others put forward the version of death due to hunger or disease. Another popular theory was that Fawcett and his company were held hostage by the indigenous people. This was a common practice. Periodically, Brazilian authorities found white hostages in Amazonian tribes, which could happen even 2 decades after their disappearance. There was even a theory that Fawcett and his companions voluntarily decided to leave civilization and lived in one of the tribes. This was reported by a French engineer who travelled through the Amazonian forests to the Washington Post. Fawcett's younger son, Brian, became interested in the engineer's stories as he provided quite a precise description of his father. However, over time, the witness's information became increasingly contradictory, and it became clear that his testimony could not be trusted. A researcher who accompanied Fawcett on almost all expeditions until World War I did not believe that Fawcett could fall victim to the tribes, as he always knew how to find a common language with the indigenous people. The first expedition to search for Fawcett set off into the Amazonian forest 3 years after his disappearance. It was led by a member of the Royal Geographical Society, George Dyott. The search operation was covered in the press no less than Fawcett's actual expedition. When Dyott published an advertisement in the newspaper seeking companions, 20,000 people responded to his proposal. The search expedition had a radio at their disposal, allowing them to promptly send news about the operation's progress. Dyott managed to find one of Fawcett's guides who agreed to lead the expedition along the missing traveller's route. After a month of travel, the searchers encountered a tribe. They noticed a scarf with the label of the company that supplied provisions and equipment for Fawcett around the neck of one of the children. Later, Dyott found an army box, similar to those Fawcett took with him. The tribe members stated that the researcher was indeed with them and left things as gifts. Later, he headed further where, according to the indigenous people, fierce tribes lived. When Dyott tried to force the tribe members to take them along Fawcett's path, the indigenous simply ran away. Dyott's expedition soon came to an end. They were attacked by members of another tribe. The radio stopped working and the searchers emerged from the jungle only after a month. Dyott concluded that Fawcett's expedition was most likely killed by members of a hostile tribe. However, there were some inconsistencies in his words. He claimed to have found marks on the trees, supposedly carved by Fawcett. This fact seems strange, considering that the traveller always tried to keep his exact route secret to prevent others from going after him. Additionally, Dyott incorrectly named one of Fawcett's guides. The items found with the tribe could indeed have been left by Fawcett as gifts, but it is possible that this happened during one of the previous expeditions. Relatives of Fawcett and Rimmel believed that Dyott was merely trying to gain popularity from Fawcett's disappearance. Indeed, immediately after the journey, he published a book and even starred in a Hollywood film based on his expedition. After that, those wishing to find Fawcett and his companions began to multiply at an incredible rate. Many perished during their expeditions. By the mid-1930s, the Brazilian government even had to officially prohibit all expeditions to search for the explorer. From that moment on, anyone wishing to conduct a search had to obtain official permission from the Brazilian authorities. Despite this, news continued to emerge over 2 decades about various discoveries related to Fawcett's expedition. Alas, none of this received sufficient confirmation. By the early 1950s, Nina Fawcett still believed that her husband and son could return from the expedition any day. At that time, Percy Fawcett was already over 80 years old, and Jack was almost 50. In 1951, a representative of the Brazilian authorities, Orlando Villas-Boas, stated that members of the Kalapalo tribe confessed to killing the group of explorers, and that he even had evidence in the form of Percy Fawcett's remains. Decades later, it became clear that Villas-Boas's information was fabricated. Researchers and journalists who managed to speak with members of the Kalapalo tribe found out that Boas offered firearms to the indigenous people if they found Fawcett's remains. Since Fawcett was very tall, almost 2 meters, the indigenous people decided to dig up the grave of their tallest tribesman and pass off his bones as the remains of the British explorer. Additionally, archives held results of an examination of the alleged remains of Fawcett. The report claimed that the bones belonged to a person slightly over 1 meter 70 centimeters tall, meaning they could not have been Fawcett's. After decades of unsuccessful searches, Nina Fawcett turned to psychics and mediums for help. Some claimed the explorer and his son were still alive, while others described their tragic deaths in painstaking detail. Around that time, Percy's younger son, Brian, weary of his mundane career as a clerk, decided to dedicate himself entirely to finding his father. He assumed his father was likely already dead by then, but thought that perhaps his brother Jack might still be alive. Brian Fawcett decided to study the Amazon jungle from the air. He scattered leaflets over the thickets, urging his brother to send a signal, and carefully examined the forests in hopes of spotting traces of the fabled city of Zed. After fruitless attempts, Brian entertained the notion that his father might have been mistaken about the lost civilization in the Amazon. He began to meticulously study his father's numerous expedition records. Brian discovered an interesting detail. In the period before the First World War, in the writings of his father, the city of Zed was described quite scientifically and pragmatically, rather than as a supernatural vast city laden with treasure. However, by the mid-1920s, the image of the lost city in the mind of Percy Fawcett began to acquire supernatural traits. The explorer became literally obsessed with this place and expressed ideas linking the city of Zed to the legendary Atlantis. Moreover, he even consulted mediums in an attempt to gain information about the city's location. In essence, it became clear that this supposed civilization in the Amazon forests was nothing more than a fantasy in Percy Fawcett's mind. However, the story did not end there. In the late 1990s, an expedition led by Michael Heckenberger discovered something resembling moats or trenches in the jungle thickets near the Xingu River. Once they mapped these trenches, they realized that the moats were part of a large settlement, which included a central plaza, walls, and other signs of complex organization. Furthermore, it later emerged that from this settlement, roads led to similar settlements, suggesting that tens of thousands of people could have once inhabited this agglomeration. While throughout the 20th century, scientists were convinced that tribes in the Amazon forests could never exceed a couple of hundred individuals due to the challenging environment. In the last few decades, researchers have found traces of similar trenches and moats across different parts of the Amazon forests. These formations, dating from 500 to 1,000 years old, indicate that long before the first Europeans arrived on the continent, there were many large settlements in the Amazon forests that even outnumbered many European cities. Thus, Fawcett was right, albeit with the misstep of looking for traces of stone buildings or massive structures. The local population used only natural materials found on site for construction, and these structures simply decomposed over time. The vast majority of the inhabitants of these settlements perished 500 years ago due to diseases brought by Europeans, leaving behind only small tribes of indigenous people. This story once again demonstrates how crucial failures are to the advancement of science. Behind every major discovery lies a significant number of setbacks. Michael Heckenberger was well acquainted with the story of the vanished British explorer, and who knows, would he have been able to make his discoveries if Percy Fawcett had not spent several decades on the unsuccessful search for the lost city?